Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Pastor Keith Foskey, pastor of Sovereign Grace Family Church in Jacksonville, Florida. Keith tweets at Your Calvinist and has one of the funniest church humor feeds I've ever come across. Keith, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Hey, Josh, thank you for having me. I appreciate being on.
Oh, I'm so glad we could get together. As we were talking about before the show, I've really enjoyed your videos and love how you accurately typecast everybody. It's fantastic.
Yeah, stereotypes are funny and there for a reason. So yeah, definitely making use of that. Yep.
For sure. Well, let's start with a little bit of your story. How did you get into ministry? And I'd love to know kind of like why you've stayed at one church for a long time. I know that's a never-ending concern in pastoral ministry of getting folks to stick around communities. And you, if I've read your website correctly, you've been at Sovereign Grace Family Church since 2006.
Yeah, it's actually longer than that. But that's how long I've been the senior or preaching pastor, whatever you want to call. We have a plurality of elders, and I'm the vocational elder, meaning that I'm the paid staff, the only one of us who is paid staff. And I actually grew up in this church. I came here when I was 7, so I've been in this church since 1987. If that gives you an idea of my age and the length of time here. My mom and dad got a divorce. I met my stepmom, and she introduced me to the church, which was at that time called Forest Christian Church, but it's the same church as it is now. We just had a name change because I grew up in the church, didn't get saved until I was 19, but when I did get saved, God never really pointed me in a different direction. He kept sort of keeping me here. Even my wife and I getting saved together, because we got married at 19, got saved in the same year. She was saved a few months before I was, and we both had a desire for this church. We both had a desire to be here for some reason. And even though at the time it was sort of we could call it somewhat theologically liberal. It was a little more conservative socially, but liberal theologically. And but I had a desire to preach, and so I started preaching some. I started teaching some, and God confirmed in my heart a call to ministry, and the church afforded me the ability to go to seminary. So I went to Jacksonville Baptist Theological Seminary, which was a local school, and the church paid for it. So when I graduated seminary, the pastor who preceded me was ready to retire, and he had been here for 13 years. So he had a long tenure as well. So he had been here for 13 years. He was ready to retire, and he and I, ministered together for a year, where he was the administrative pastor and I was the preaching pastor. And I was only 25. And then he retired completely in 2006, and I took the position in 2006. We went through a time of reformation for the next few years because I was becoming a Calvinist. I was learning Calvinistic soteriology and applying those things to my preaching and understanding of the scriptures. And within the next 4 or 5 years, we became a Reformed confessional church, whereas in 2011, we changed our name to Sovereign Grace Family Church. So longer story than you probably expected, but that's how it's happened. And I just I've never had a desire to be anywhere else. God has raised me here, and Lord willing, I'll die here. But we don't ever know what God's going to do. So, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Couple of follow-up questions on that. First off, just for my audience is probably less theologically astute. So could you specify just a little bit what you mean by theologically liberal, and then what did that movement to being a bit more reformed? What all did that entail?
That's a great question. When I say theologically liberal, like the church would always have affirmed certain things as sin. Like we think of liberals as people who might affirm things like LGBT or something like that. This church would have always said those things were sinful. That's, those are not things Christians should be doing. But where theologically liberal would be, people didn't really understand the foundations of things like the Trinity and the doctrines like justification by faith alone, and things like that were more flexible, and sometimes to the point where even heresy was allowed to be brought in. For instance, in the 80s, we had a pastor who didn't even believe in the virgin birth.
Oh,
So, yeah, so we can talk about theologically liberal. That's a theological liberal. That's someone who may be socially conservative and may hold to conservative values, on things like finances or sexuality or things like that. But when it comes to the whether or not Moses really parted the Red Sea, that may be a question because they're not holding to a firm understanding of what the scripture teaches. So when I say we went through a reformation, the first reformation in our church really was a reforming of going back to the biblical standards. I remember a man in our church coming to my home and chastising me for this very early in my ministry, chastising me for some of the things I was preaching. And I said to him, but this is what the Bible teaches. And he says, well, I don't believe the whole Bible.
oh,
And I was like, oh, okay. I said, well, then you're in the wrong church. And I said, I can throw a stick and hit 3 churches that don't believe the Bible. You're welcome to go there. I said, but we in this church preach and teach the Bible is true from beginning to end. And he didn't like that, but I didn't care. But that's what I mean by socially liberal. Now, when it comes to Reformation, I was introduced to Reformed theology in 2004. I was speaking at a youth camp, and the youth leader was Calvinistic, and he introduced me to Reformed theology, challenged me on some things. And over a period of about 2 years, I began to study and see that I believe these things are in the scriptures. And so became pretty confirmed in my Calvinism within that 2-3 year period of study. And I wasn't calling myself a Calvinist. That came later. That actually came as a response to something that happened in our community. There was a local pastor. I walked into a restaurant and the local pastor saw me and he said, "That guy's a Calvinist." And I laughed, and I said, and when he realized I heard him, he got embarrassed. And I was like, I don't care. You're right. But that's where your Calvinist came from. I just said, I guess I'm the neighborhood Calvinist. I'm your Calvinist. If you're looking for a Calvinist, I'm your guy. That's sort of where that,
okay.
so I sign off all of my podcasts with I'm Keith Foskey and I'm your Calvinist. Right. So
That's great. I love the story behind the handle. Tell me a little bit about I'm always interested in institutional change. I mean, I think it's one of the things that is just, I'm a lifelong Southern Baptist. It's theologically impossible to be born a Southern Baptist, but it's culturally normal. That's my story. I came to faith when I was 8, when I had been Southern Baptist since before I was born. But I mean, and we're always in this, I feel like we Southern Baptists are always in flux with institutional alignment and development. My dad raised me with the line that we're always only one generation away from apostasy.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
so I'm really curious about what did those 4 or 5 years that you described as kind of this reformational period, what did that look like as the preaching elder? I mean, is that a lot of firing and hiring, or is that just like faithfully preaching and building consensus? Is it a mix, or like what practically did that look like from a leadership angle?
Two things. We didn't have staff. Our church has always been small. Even now we only run about 100 people, which is not super small, but it's not anywhere near big church. It's right in that sort of mid to small church range. And so we didn't have a staff that I had to hire or fire anyone. I did have elders that I had to bring along, and there were elders who were opposing Reformed theology that I had to deal with. But the most difficult thing happened in 2008 when we had one secretary. I just said we didn't have staff. We had a secretary. He worked twice a week.
Sure.
Who was very opposed to Reformed theology, and he began to have meetings in his home and try to create a coalition of people to have me removed. In fact, the preacher who called me the Calvinist in the restaurant is one of the preachers that he went to try to get the information on Calvinism, Calvin burned Servetus and all this stuff, all these things that were, sort of your anti-Calvinist lines. These are reasons why you should reject Calvinism. And so I had to struggle with that. I almost resigned. I still have my resignation letter. And on the Sunday I was thinking I was going to resign, I spoke to Tom Askell a few days before. Tom Askell is the head of the Founders Ministries. Mm-hmm. And Tom gave me some of the best advice I've ever gotten. He said, don't quit. He said, make them fire you. He said, but don't quit. He said, if they fire you for preaching the gospel, that's their fault. He said, but if you quit, that's your fault. So I said, okay, I'm not going to quit. I'm just going to keep preaching, and God will work it out to his glory however he sees fit. And if he sees fit that means I get removed, then I get removed. And by God's grace, I'm still here. And so there were some times where I had to stand up publicly and make some statements that were like, I was accused of believing that babies go to hell. That was probably one of the more controversial things. I don't believe that, but that was one of the things that was, well, Calvinists believe babies are going to hell. So I just held up John MacArthur's book, which says saved without or safe in the arms of Christ, which is about infants who die in infancy. I said, well, John MacArthur's a Calvinist and this is what he believes. And so to say that all Calvinists believe that is not true, therefore your argument is not true. So those were little moments of, having to stand. But I will say this, I had the best of friends and one of our elders who is still one of my best friends in the world. And he's now 87 or 88 years old. He was one of my elders who supported me, even though he didn't understand. I remember him asking me, he said, Keith, people say you're a John Calvin believer. What does that mean? So he didn't even know what it meant, but he cared enough about me to listen to what the Word of God taught. He cared enough about me to listen and be willing to stand alongside and see change and see that. And I don't think if I had not have had him, I don't think it would have worked the way that it did. I had an older man in the congregation who the people trusted, who God was using as a mentor and a partner for me in a time of real change. So if anybody's going through institutional change, if you're struggling with this, I would say one of the most valuable things to have is somebody who the church trusts, that you come alongside of and partner with and help them to catch the idea of the vision that you have so that they can help you see it become a reality.
Sure. As you're describing that, I'm remembering a seminary professor who had this line. He worked into every class. I did my MDiv at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And this professor's line was, most new pastors overestimate what they will accomplish in 5 years and vastly underestimate what they can accomplish in 10 years.
Yeah.
And I took that one to heart. It's like, there's a lot of value in being in a place and being there for a long time. And over time, the longer you're in that place, the more you can see what's possible. But I was like, in my space in education, I think it's definitely true that just like, oh my goodness, you're a brand new teacher and you think you're going to change the world and you really just need to learn all of your kids' names.
Yeah.
But once you've been in a classroom for 5 or 6 years, you just start to see there's so much more you can do. And you see how these small changes make so much impact over time. So I appreciate you being willing to tell that story. That's fascinating. I love there are plenty of folks who get rightly sacked out of ministry for being unfaithful or for being unbiblical. But I love hearing stories of men who are just faithful to Scripture and are in it for the long haul. Let's shift gears a little bit because we initially got together not to hear church war stories, so those are great. I want to talk about your denominational videos. So how on earth what was the impetus behind making these videos? How did you come up with this idea?
I have a very funny wife, and I usually say that right out of the gate. This was all her idea, and it started as we have had a podcast for 3 years called Conversations with a Calvinist, and it never was super popular, but I had a small audience, and one day we started noticing that the short videos were catching on. See, we would do an hour-long podcast, and it was hard to get an audience for that. And we wanted to try to increase our audience. I mean, it's what everybody does, right? We all want to have people who hear what we have to say. And so, I mean, to be honest, right? You want us, yeah. So she was watching these short videos on it was when YouTube Shorts first came out, and then because of TikTok's popularity, we saw that, and she said we should do a short video, and maybe that would drum up some attention for the podcast. I said that's a good idea. Let's write some ideas down. So we wrote a few ideas down, and I did a few like top 5 books I've ever read or things like that, little 1-minute videos that were good, and got a little bit of attention. But one day we were joking, and we said what would be funny is if all the denominations came to a meeting and had a conversation. So I wrote this 1-minute script where I had 5 different denominations. It was Baptist, Pentecostal, Big Eva, Presbyterian, and a Mormon. There was a Mormon in it, in the first one. And the Mormon wasn't let in. They wouldn't let him through the door. That was the joke, right? The Mormon couldn't get in the meeting. So we posted that on TikTok. And in one day, it got like 90,000 views. And so that was like, okay, there's an audience for this type of humor. And so we wrote a second video, and it did okay. Didn't do quite as well, but I was like, well, we'll keep going. So we did a third video and a fourth video. Now we're at 23 denominational meetings. We've met over everything from the Super Bowl to Christmas and all those things. And the most popular one I've ever done is when the denominations went shooting, because it was a crossover thing. People who love denominational humor and people who love guns love that video, because I was shooting real guns in my father's backyard. I was at we have a little range in my dad's backyard. So I shot a variety of firearms, each one representing a different denomination. And for some reason that one's over 300,000 views on YouTube, which is different than TikTok. To get 300,000 views on TikTok for me was a pretty big accomplishment. So, yeah.
Well, I apologies to anybody who tuned into this episode just because they really want the jokes, but I want to ask a couple advice questions then, because I have debated more internally about whether or not I want to even try to get on TikTok, just because the only time I try to get on TikTok, and maybe this just says more about the remaining presence of sin in me than anything else, I don't know, but the kind of content that TikTok directed me to was just so corrosive.
Oh yeah.
And depressing. I was like, ew, I don't really want to put my stuff on this channel. So what did you do? Like, how do you use TikTok and use it well?
That's a great question. 2 thoughts. One, I don't have TikTok on my phone. That for me is sort of a safeguard, because TikTok is a labyrinth. You can get lost in TikTok. You can waste 3 hours on TikTok in easily, because it so grabs you in. And some of the things, you're right, are bad, but even the things that aren't bad are sometimes so interesting and so quick that it can just drag you in. So I don't want it on my phone. Also, it's possibly Chinese spyware, so I don't want that on my phone. but for the most part, what we have done is we have taken another avenue for uploading. So we upload to TikTok, but I don't watch TikTok. So I'm a contributor, not a consumer of TikTok. So that helps me with sort of safeguarding my heart. My wife, she doesn't have it on her phone either, but she looks at it on her computer some, and she's more comfortable with TikTok than I am. Like I said, I sort of try to stay off of it. But in fact, I would have never done TikTok if it weren't for my friend Matt David. I want to give him a shout out. He's a member of our church. He got saved. And this is to tell you, if you want to, you asked the question about, should you be on TikTok? He actually got saved by somebody sharing the gospel on TikTok. And right. So he has a different attitude toward TikTok than I did. He was like, Keith, there's an audience here. There's people here who want to have good, clean Christian content, things that they can enjoy, things that actually, and I do have many gospel videos too that are on there that point people to Christ. He said, this is the public square. This is where people are going. This is where we need to be doing. So he created my TikTok account for me. He posted the first video. It was at 3:00 on a Saturday. We were actually shooting. He and I had gone shooting. He posted the video while we were on the range. 12 hours later, we're at church, 9 a.m. church. Well, I guess 18 hours later, whatever it was, from 3:00 till 9:00 the next morning. He walks into the church. He says, Keith, have you seen the TikTok video? I said, no, I don't have TikTok. He said, it has 90,000 views. And I said, oh, okay. So that was but he did that for me. And for a while, he posted all my videos. Now I post them because it just became a little bit easier for me to do it. But
sure.
But like I said, I don't do it on my phone.
No, that makes perfect sense. I just think that's it's my audio engineer. I have a high school student who loves editing, and she hopes to go into media. Her name's Madison. She's at the closing credits for every episode once they've been edited. Her advice to me about season 5, which is when this episode will air, was that we really ought to try and expand to TikTok. And I was hesitant, but I maybe this is helpful. Maybe there's a way to do that well.
Yeah, and if you can make some shorter content, maybe take a 2-minute section of an interview, or even yourself, you're a seminary student or graduate, so you could take and put information like, hey, as a person who went to seminary, here's 5 things I learned about seminary. A video like that from somebody who was at the seminary, or here's 5 reasons why I attended Southwestern or wherever you said
Southeastern, but
yeah. So those types of videos they catch people's attention. And so, I mean, I don't know how many people are interested in this, but you and I are learning. Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
These are my favorite episodes where I forget that I'm recording, and it's just
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm a new friend. We're chatting. Tell me a little bit about, hopefully anybody listening to this episode is familiar with the general Baptist stereotypes and Methodist stereotypes. And I attended an Orthodox Presbyterian church in college, and you just nailed the cigar smoking Presbyterians so well. But talk to me just a little bit about how did you kind of come up with your caricature for Big Eva? Because that's such a broad term, and it's been used by a lot of people in the last couple of years. I've at least seen it a lot more in the last couple of years. But yeah, tell us a bit more about Big Eva as a character.
Big Eva is Rick Warren. I mean, I'm wearing a Rick Warren shirt. I have the attitude of bigger is always better, greater numbers through bigger entertainment, that attitude. And I've given Rick Warren a hard time I have a show called Church Soup. I don't know if you know about that, but it's my news show that I do.
What was that title one more time?
Church Soup is the name. And it's a news, I do it about once every 3 weeks, where I'll compile news articles from church events and things, and I'll make fun of it. Well, a few months ago, Rick Warren gave a posthumous degree to Charles Spurgeon, a posthumous Master of Divinity degree. And I thought that was just the most ironic thing in the world, that Rick Warren is going to award a degree to Charles Spurgeon. I mean, that's like, Bruce Lee getting an award from Daniel LaRusso. That doesn't, it's not, it just doesn't fit. But Rick Warren is the quintessential Big Eva guy. And so when I channel that character, I'm channeling my inner Rick Warren. But obviously there's other guys. There's, your Russell Moores and guys like that who are also would be considered Big Eva. And also your mega church, multi-site. That's what I always say. It's the Big Eva multi-site mega church in Mini Mall. That's the church. Yeah. So
I think I'm podcasting today from Thales College, and we're right here in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. So JD Greer in the Summit Church is our local big mega church, and I've heard JD preach a couple of times, and it's always biblical. It's just biblical light, if that makes sense. It's like, and it's there. I know plenty of people who find a great home in Summit, and it's not bad. I love the depth that our church gets to in a different way. Well, I think that is hilarious that Rick Warren is Big Eva. I got to do something with that line. I assume you watched. Did you watch, or were you at the SBC convention this summer with the Al Mohler, Rick Warren showdown at the mic with their debating against each other moment?
I wasn't there. Our church isn't SBC, so I'm not even sure I could have attended. But I did reference it on my show. I actually did a full review of the sermon that was preached, the main sermon for the event.
Oh, I'm gonna go find that.
Yeah,
my wife and I both listened to that, and we were kind of like, oh
yeah. I'd be interested in your thoughts if you hear my review, if you listen to it, I'd be interested in your thoughts, because I do that as well. Like I said, my podcast is sort of all over the map. I've done everything from food reviews to we did what's the best bottled water to give your preacher. We've done everything. We've done this for years and just do a variety of things. But sometimes I will listen to a sermon and for the first time, listen to it and give an on-time review of the sermon. And I did that for the SBC. But I also am familiar with the Rick Warren thing. Yeah, I saw that, and it was wild what happened there.
Just it was the convention is almost a typical convention year is like 90% business. This is the first time in a long time where, I mean, it just felt like actually about 60% business and about 38% denominational debate strife. And that was really like, it was the, it was two older statesmen of different visions of what it means to be Southern Baptist going head to head. And I think I don't think I was alone in this. I was looking to that moment to be like, am I willing to still call myself a Southern Baptist? Like that was at stake for me in that moment. And with Mohler's articulation and the result of the vote, my answer was still yes. I'm still willing to say being Southern Baptist is a biblically faithful position for a Christian. And there's a lot of institutional stuff I love about this. But man, if it's just drifting that direction, I'm like, that's I don't want any part of that. But that was very exciting. I love that brief moment of big denominational drama.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, tell me just a little bit about why. Where do you see the role of humor in your ministry? I mean, you're clearly wired to see these insights, and you have some part of you that wants to use them. So, where do you see humor and ministry kind of coinciding?
I get this question a lot, and I think something to point out is I've always loved comedy. I've always been more apt to listen to people tell stories than I have to listen to music. Like if you like driving down the road, you know, when I was a kid, I wouldn't listen to music. I would listen to comedians, or I would listen to storytellers. And some of the guys that I remember specifically, one was named Dennis Swanberg. He was a comedian back in the 70s and the 80s. He was a Christian comedian, and he was called, I love this phrase, and I would love to have this applied to me one day. He was called a minister of encouragement. That was what he called himself. He said, I'm a minister of encouragement. And he would go to churches and he would give the gospel, he would evangelize, but he would do so in the context of telling stories. And a lot of them were funny stories from his youth. He did impressions of Don Knotts and Jimmy Stewart and these very famous actors. And he was a great impressionist. And he tells the stories of growing up as a poor young boy and being able to learn these voices and get people's attention by doing impressions. And I was actually a magician in high school. I worked as a professional magician from 1996 to 1998. I worked with a company called DeLand Entertainment. So I've always enjoyed performing, if you want to say that term. I've always enjoyed making people laugh or making people smile, encouraging people, ministering to people in that way. So that's where I would say I see value in it. I look at somebody like Ray Comfort. Ray Comfort is one of my favorite evangelists. And when he goes out onto the boardwalk, he always brings a little magic trick with him, or he always tells a funny story or something to get the crowd around so that he can then share the gospel. So these things are not the end. They're a means to an end, right? They're pointing to something better and something more important. So I think that it's a tool. Some might say that's somewhat pragmatic, but I would say, listen, this is not how I preach. This is another avenue to reach people. This is not my preaching ministry. And I don't know if you've seen any of my preaching videos. I'm not a clown in the pulpit. I'm not a jokester in the pulpit. I believe that the pulpit is a sacred desk. I believe it's a place for the gospel to be proclaimed. That doesn't mean I'll never say anything funny. I have, but I look at somebody like R.C. Sproul, who would sometimes use a well-timed quip to lighten the heart of the people or get their attention back, focus on what he's saying. But I would never get up there and do, an hour of stand-up as a sermon and call it a sermon. So there's a definite disconnect. And like I said, this all came about by accident because my wife is funnier than me. So by doing something funny, it got people to listen. And I said, okay, well, this is funny. Let's keep doing it so that we can build an audience and allow people to hear more of what, like I said, and now I've had the opportunity to talk about amillennialism. I did a little debate with Doug Wilson. I've had an opportunity to share sermons. We have an academy at our church where we teach it's a free 2-year ministry training program, 8 core classes that are all taught either by me or someone else qualified to teach those classes. and it mirrors the seminary experience I had, in the sense that the classes are built the same way the seminary classes I took. You have books to read and tests to take and things like that. And so we provide that, and we now have more students than we've ever had because people have been introduced to me through the humor videos. I've had pastors contact me because I make myself available because they want somebody to talk to about the struggles they're having in ministry, and they don't have a close ministry friend. I've had at least 3 to 4 pastors reach out to me because they were having a struggle in their church, and they just wanted to ask what I thought about it because they knew that I had gone through struggles in my church because I told those stories on the podcast. So that's, again, ministry of encouragement, right? So Dennis Swanberg, one day I want to hold your title, sir.
There we go.
Yeah. So
I love that. I remember again, I did a pastoral internship years ago at Christ Covenant Church in Raleigh, and Tom Mercer is the pastor, and he had one night where there's 6 of us in the internship, and he sat us all down. I was like, let's talk about humor. And we all immediately had some preacher that were like, oh, I love the way he tells this joke. And Tom kind of stopped us all and was like, that's great that y'all have funny preachers that you like, but he encouraged us that he thinks about humor as a double-sided weapon that can turn against you in preaching really fast, because people walk away from your sermon, they don't remember the passage or the application or the exegesis, they remember the joke. Yeah. It's like, as a preacher, you don't want them to remember you, and they remember you as the funny guy who had a good joke. Instead, you want them to remember Christ, and you want them to remember his word. And so he's still, to this day, I've always been attentive to, like, when he does crack a joke, and oh man, he made an allusion to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and he got Aslan's animal species wrong, and we've never been able to let him forget. He'll go to his, like, we might tag his tombstone someday with Aslan the tiger welcomes you into eternity.
Oh, that's funny.
I don't think he ever listens to my show, but if he does, he'll hear the show out. But yeah, I love that's an amazing way to, if you've got and some people just don't have the gift to do comedy. And you clearly do. I mean, and that performance element is itself a gift that God has given you to be able to use for his kingdom. So I love hearing about the way you've been able to kind of hold that in. And it's interesting to me that comes after many years of full-time ministry. This is not a gimmick that, like, is launching a ministry or anything like that. This is something that's happening inside and maybe adjacent to inside your work as a pastor. And that's really cool.
Yeah. I'll add just one thought. I mean, to go take too much time, but that I appreciate you said that, because this isn't, like I said, like you said, it's not a gimmick. It's not, ministry is my life. And this is what I've been doing ever since I got saved, is in some way, shape, or form been in ministry. This is just, I jokingly say sometimes nobody cared what I had to say until I put on the bow tie, right? So if I ever write a book, that'll be the title. Nobody cared until I put on the bow tie. For some reason that got people's attention, and I said, okay, well, that's fine. And some people might think that's wrong and say, oh, well, all he wants is attention. No, all I want to do is proclaim Christ and preach the gospel. And this is an avenue. Humor is an avenue to make people laugh, develop relationships, encourage people. And I have had a ton of people write me letters and say how much they appreciate that I made them laugh, or that they, I brought levity. Methodists don't like me, and I understand. No, even I've had Methodists who love me. They know I'm just poking fun, and especially good, solid Methodists. And there are. I'm a Calvinist, but I do believe there are brothers and sisters at the Methodist Church who see the downward trend of their denomination. They understand I'm not poking at them. I'm poking at the reality of what's happening in their denomination. And it's not funny in the sense that what's happening, but you can make fun of something that's not funny. And that's what points out the fact that it's not funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it points to, I mean, and so much of it depends on where you're standing. Cause I'm sure I'm sure progressive Christians would listen to both of us and say, like, y'all totally misunderstand what it means to love your neighbor. And we would both look at them and say, you misunderstand what it means.
Absolutely.
But they're the same thing. And the same thing is happening inside wings of the Anglican Communion. And As far as I understand it, the Episcopalian Church is basically a wash. I mean, I don't know that there's much hope left there, but found great encouragement in the response from the African bishops a couple years ago, arriving in force to American Methodism. And
Yeah, they saved Methodism at least for a season, for sure.
well, I wanted to ask you about that too, because I do love that you portray the United Methodist Church, like literally, and I have yet to see any of your videos where I'm like, nope, don't know any Methodists who've said that, or nope, don't know where they put that on their website. Like the caricatures you draw they're literally what they say about themselves. And I had a debate tournament a couple years ago up at Harvard that I was taking students to, and as we're walking around Harvard, I mean, there are all these historic churches, and they're flying Black Lives Matter and rainbow flags, and depending on if you're there anywhere near June, like it just gets more exciting and crazy. But I mean, I did make a point to just help my students be aware. Like, you just need to be aware that whatever you think about Christianity, like all of these churches are something different, and they are 2, 3, in some cases 400 years old, but they're no longer a Unitarian Congregationalist church. It was never Christian to begin with, but now it's especially no longer Christian. And so I just think it's you draw your videos kind of highlight the distinction. I read a sociologist who I think is at Baylor, but I couldn't remember his name in order to time to write it down with the notes. But he was making this really interesting argument that our faith is literally from an academic study of religion perspective. It seems like Christianity is dividing into a biblical Christianity and a progressive Christianity, to the extent that maybe in 10, 20, 100 years from now, we will look back and say, oh, that's when these two religions kind of diverged. Would you agree with that, or do you think that's wrong? Or what are your thoughts on that as a conceptual framework for our moment in Christendom, as it were?
No, I think that's true, and I would say it's not now. I think I think what you're describing happened 100 years ago. I don't think it happened. I don't think that's happening now. I think we are seeing the result of what happened. I think if when this is studied from a historical perspective, if Jesus tarries and we're here for another 300, 400, 500 years, and our descendants study us as their ancestors, I think they're going to see that some of the major shifting happened in the early 20th century, really later 19th century, early 20th century, when the churches began to give up their foundational theological moorings and began to teach the social benefits of Christ without teaching the theological truths of Christ. And that's what we see is we see what became known as the social gospel, where Christianity is all about loving and doing good and providing help and being a benefit to people, but without Christ. Did you ever see the movie Time Changer?
Maybe.
It was a
lot of sci-fi, so I'm trying to remember which one that is.
Well, this was actually a Christian. This was a Christian movie. It was one of those sort of B quality Christian movies, sort of your.
I try to avoid those, but so I may not have seen this one.
Well, I do too, but this particular one caught my attention because it was about time travel, and I'm a big sci-fi nerd. So, what it was there was a seminary professor in the 1800s who gets the opportunity to go forward in time and to see the results of his teaching, because he was teaching that you could have Christ's social benefits without having Christ's theological teachings.
I have seen this. It's been a long time, but I have seen this. Yes.
Yeah. And even though that movie is, not a great film in the sense of acting and things like that, I think it told an important truth. It showed where the marked change in historic Christianity happened. Because what happened is the church became functionally anti-supernatural. And so it began to jettison the ideas of things like miracles and Christ's resurrection and Christ's atonement and the justification that comes through faith because of the penal substitutionary atonement of Christ. Those things were put aside and replaced with a gospel that doesn't save, a social gospel that doesn't save. And what we see now, 100 years later, is we see entire denominations that have no theological foundation, and therefore they will adopt anything the world needs them to adopt to appear nice or kind. They will adopt anything that the world tells them is loving, and the world currently is telling them that what loving is to affirm sin and to affirm self-mutilation and things like that, because those things are supposedly expressions of love. And so I would say we are seeing the results of what you described.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right. I mean, that's if I'm remembering church history too correctly, that's the fundamentalism modernism controversy.
Exactly, and I think was it Machen, if I'm thinking correctly, who
Machen, Christianity and liberalism. I mean, he's one of those folks who I put him and C.S. Lewis kind of up there together as folks who you read them today and you're just like, oh my goodness. I don't know if they would have either would have claimed the gift of prophecy, but they certainly feel prophetic when we go back and look at them today.
Absolutely.
I was teaching at a class this morning where my student and I were talking through Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, and we got into a lengthy discussion about the difference between supernatural and natural. Because Tolkien makes the argument that God is supernatural and that fairies are natural in the sense of like a fairy tale and the elves and so on. And in that, it just kind of struck me that I think this fits what you're describing. I mean, the claims of the Bible are supremely supernatural.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a natural order. There is a grace given in creation. There are natural laws that are, as far as we can tell, always operative within this frame. And yet God himself is beyond that frame. And if he is an omniscient, omnipotent, loving being, then he is outside of anything that we recognize inside this frame. And I wonder if we could even think of if that shift is also a shift from recognizing that Christianity is a religion that is founded upon a supernatural premise, that God exists and he has spoken, and that tells us the initial awareness of reality. And then trying to fit that inside a natural frame cuts off everything that doesn't fit inside of, or anything that is beyond nature. That move into modernism refuses to look at anything outside of nature. Yeah. Anyway, that's on. We could probably go on about that for a long time. Like that's I might have to get you back on the show. This is really fun.
Yeah, I love church history. I love talking about these things. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm actually teaching church history at my church right now. We're doing a first of 4 parts. The first part is we're doing ancient Christianity, and we're about to have a look at all the early missionary stories with Gregory Thaumaturgus and Patrick of Ireland and Boniface is the other guy I wanted to touch on. We're not going to read that new book, The Boniface Option, but I definitely want to get the story of Boniface chopping down the tree. That'll be really fun. Let me ask you one last comedy related question, and we'll probably have to draw this to a close. But I am curious about your thoughts on this. Is it harder to do comedy or to even find humor in a politically correct age? I remember even 10 years ago, shows seemed like they were funnier. Shows today just seem like they're not nearly as funny. So I'm curious, somebody who's actively doing comedy, does our politically correct atmosphere make it just more challenging to do humor?
Well, the simple answer, does the politically correct climate make it harder to do comedy? The answer is yes, because in our world today, someone like Mel Brooks would not be able to even begin to produce the things that he was able to produce, because it wouldn't be tolerated. It would be insensitive. And what's funny about, and I mentioned Mel Brooks because what's funny about him, even though I know there's a lot of crassness in his humor and things, what he did do was he held up a mirror against things like racism. Mm-hmm. And he held up a mirror against things that we would see as things you shouldn't joke about. And he said, no, if you joke about them, it takes away their power. If you joke about this thing, it takes away its power. And therefore you get something that points to the fact of how ridiculous racism is from the virtue of humor. And humor knocks it down and makes it no longer a powerful thing. And so with that, what we have done is by being politically correct and by shielding ourselves from humor and by insulating ourselves, we've shot ourselves in the proverbial foot because we've taken away one of the tools that we could use to actually fight against genuine injustices and genuine problems. And so most comedians recognize this as a problem. They recognize things like, I know this is way off the subject, but what happened at the Oscars a few years ago with Chris Rock is absolutely deplorable. And I consider myself not a comedian, but a comedically minded person. And so I could see how that changed the entire atmosphere. If I stand up here and say something that offends someone, are they going to attack me physically?
Sure.
Right. That changes I actually did a podcast on that called The Slap Heard Around the World because I wanted to talk about how that changes the atmosphere of standing up and saying something that may offend someone and the fear that that person may physically attack you. And it's happened. It's actually happened. And this has been documented that in some comedy clubs, there have been what they would say, not mirrors, but copycat. Like guys get up and get offended and hit or try to attack the comedian.
Sure.
Because they saw it on a national stage. And so I know that's really not the direction you were going, but that's one of the problems, right? So in a politically correct, are there times when I say, yeah, I shouldn't say that because because of the climate? Rarely, but it does come up. I'm more concerned with what honors Christ. I'm more concerned with what's true. Like for instance, I'll give you, here's a good one. A few weeks ago, I was doing a church soup. And if you've never seen church soup, imagine Saturday Night Live Weekend Update, but about church. Okay. That's the model, right?
All right. I'm going to subscribe when this episode is over.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I did, Wayne Brady, who's a comedian, came out as pansexual.
I saw something about that. Yeah.
Well, I had a hilarious joke about it, but after I recorded it, I said it, I showed it to my wife, and we both sat down and we said, this is not good. Not because it was politically incorrect, but because I know that there are kids in my church who watch my show.
Oh, sure.
And so for me, I'm more concerned about the fact that all of our church members watch my shows. All of our church members often watch them with their kids. And while the joke was funny, it was not something that I would want to say to a child. And so I'm careful about that. I'm more careful about knowing who my audience is and knowing that my audience begins with people in my church. And I don't want to do anything that they would have to explain to their kids or something. So I'm more concerned about that than I am with political correctness.
No, I think that's really helpful because I think there's certainly hopefully no one who listens to my show regularly will be surprised at all if I say I'm squarely, I put myself somewhere on the right with traditionalist conservatism in the vein of Russell Kirk and T.S. Eliot and Brad Berzer and other folks of that ilk. But I think sometimes folks on the right who talk about comedy and humor, they almost want to, they'll talk about wanting to like recover a shock jock value for the sake of shock jock, and they'll defend freedom of speech in the sense like to the extent that like they go way past any level of decency or reasonable caution or discretion. I think what you just described, I mean, it reminds me of the Apostle Paul's discussion of Christian liberty, and it's like, I can do all things, but should I do all things? Like that really is the question. And I think there are plenty of things I'm just like, nope, I would not. There are things I could go read about. I could go study deeply, and I'm interested. But honestly, those things are bad for me. I'd study them in deep detail. It's enough for me to know, yeah, that's not what I'm called to do. So I think I think you took. I didn't have any particular angle I was fishing for on that question. I think you answered that really well. There's got to be a way to appreciate humor and to see the hilarious ridiculousness of this world God has given us without going just down this crudity level. I mean, and there may be a time and a place when the audience is right and it's justified, but I think like you just gave us a great example of the kind of clarity that we really ought to have in thinking about questions of humor. Well, Pastor Foskey, let me close out with asking you your thoughts about a verse in Proverbs. Proverbs 17:22. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. Does this verse give us a biblical foundation for appreciating the hilariousness of the world?
Yeah, and I memorized that passage in the King James, which says, "A merry heart doeth good like a medicine."
Mm.
And I love that way of saying it because it does. That was actually something that Dennis Swanberg, going back to him, and by the way, on your last question, Dennis Swanberg, I would never be afraid to let my kids listen to. I would never be afraid because he was always he was hilarious and clean, and it was good and it was solid stuff. But he used to say that. He said, the Bible says, "A merry heart doeth good like a medicine." So I hope that what I've done for you tonight is good for your heart, and that it's been like a medicine, that this humor, that this laughter that I've provided has done your heart good like a medicine. So yeah, I think that is definitely something, again, as I try to carry on his, the ideas that he fostered, I think that verse is very valuable for sure.
Excellent. Well, Pastor Foskey, thank you so much for joining me today. How can people find and follow your work online?
Easiest way is to go to YouTube, and you don't have to go to YouTube. Just type in calvinistpodcast.com, and that directs directly to our YouTube page. So calvinistpodcast.com. And when you get to the YouTube page, make sure you hit subscribe, and then go to a playlist, hit play, and let it play overnight so that it... If you like a video, hit thumbs up. If you don't like a video, hit thumbs down twice. And that's a joke too, because if you hit thumbs down twice, it goes away. Okay. So anyway, if you would go onto our YouTube page, that's the best way to see. If you want to hear the podcast, because we do a weekly podcast. If you want to hear it, just go to any podcast platform, Apple, Google, or anywhere, and just type in "Conversations with a Calvinist" or my name, Keith Foskey, and it'll come up. You can follow me on Twitter at Your Calvinist, as you mentioned earlier. If you want to interact with me, that's probably the best way to do it, is through Twitter. But if you want to write a letter or send me a message, you can send me a message at calvinistpodcast@gmail.com. That's specifically for the show. And I take show requests, interview requests, things like that at calvinistpodcast@gmail.com.
Fantastic. I might spend a moment thinking about what I would love to see the denominations debate about. I might send you a couple of ideas for a future episode. I just still love that as a gimmick. It's a great, and you could run that for a long time. There's a lot of things these denominations are silly about.
We have a big project we're working on. Did you see the denominations play Jeopardy? Did you see that?
I did.
Well, we have a different one. It's a different game show that we're working on. I won't give too much away, but it's probably the most ambitious project that my wife and I have tried to put together, and it's going to take a little while to produce. But once it's produced, I think it's going to be really funny. So be looking forward to that.
Fantastic. We'll do that. Thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Pastor Keith Foskey of Sovereign Grace Family Church at Your Calvinist. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.